The origins of the Orcs in Tolkien's Middle-earth are steeped in mystery, darkness, and the complex mythology that underpins the entire legendarium. To fully understand what became of the Orcs after the ring was destroyed, it is crucial to first delve into their beginnings, as their very nature and creation are deeply tied to the forces of evil that shaped the history of Middle-earth. The creation of the Orcs is a subject of much debate among scholars of Tolkien's work, largely because Tolkien himself grappled with the exact origins and nature of these creatures throughout his life. In his earliest writings, which later formed the basis of the Silmarillion, the Orcs were described as being bred from the corrupted elves captured by Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. These elves, who were twisted and deformed through torture and dark sorcery, were transformed into the first Orcs, a race of beings enslaved to the will of their creator. Morgoth, originally named Melkor, was one of the most powerful of the Ainur, the divine spirits created by Eru Ilúvatar, the supreme deity in Tolkien's mythology. Melkor rebelled against the will of Ilúvatar and sought to dominate Middle-earth. In his quest for power, he turned to the creation of the Orcs, beings who would serve as his foot soldiers in his wars against the elves, men, and the other free peoples of Middle-earth. The Orcs were bred to be numerous, strong, and utterly loyal to Morgoth, though their loyalty was born more out of fear and domination than any true allegiance. Tolkien later explored other possible origins for the Orcs, particularly in his later letters and unpublished writings. One such theory suggests that the Orcs could have been corrupted men, rather than elves, twisted by Morgoth's dark influence. This theory is grounded in the idea that men, being more malleable and less immortal than elves, could have been easier to corrupt and manipulate. However, this idea introduces moral and theological dilemmas, particularly regarding the fate of the souls of these Orcs, which Tolkien himself never fully resolved. Regardless of their exact origins, what remains consistent across Tolkien's writings is the inherent corruption and evil that define the Orcs. Unlike other creatures in Middle-earth, the Orcs are not simply another race with a different culture or way of life. They are inherently malevolent, driven by a deep-seated hatred for all that is good, and this malevolence is a direct result of their creation by Morgoth. Their bodies were twisted, their minds filled with malice, and their spirits bound to the will of their Dark Master. This corruption is so pervasive that it not only affects their actions, but also their very existence, making them creatures of perpetual misery and hatred. The Orcs' role in Middle-earth is intricately tied to the overarching themes of darkness and light, good and evil, that permeate Tolkien's works. Morgoth's creation of the Orcs was an act of ultimate defiance against Ilúvatar's design, an attempt to mock and undermine the beauty and harmony of the world. The Orcs, in this sense, are a perversion of life itself, a grotesque reflection of the elves and men who were created by Ilúvatar. They are, as some scholars have suggested, the embodiment of Morgoth's rebellion against the natural order, creatures that should not exist in the world as it was intended. The physical characteristics of the Orcs further underscore their corrupted nature. They are typically depicted as grotesque, with misshapen bodies, brutish features, and a generally repulsive appearance. Their skin is often described as dark or black, though some variations exist, with some Orcs being pale or sickly in color. Their eyes are often red or yellow, glowing with a malevolent light that hints at the darkness within them. Their mouths are filled with sharp, jagged teeth, and their limbs are often twisted or malformed, reflecting the pain and suffering that were intrinsic to their creation. Orc society, if it can be called such, is marked by chaos, brutality, and a strict hierarchy enforced through fear and violence. Unlike the more civilized races of Middle-earth, the Orcs have no true culture or civilization of their own. They live in crude, squalid conditions, often in the deep caves and dark places of the world, where they can hide from the light they so despise. Their settlements are more like encampments or warrens, hastily constructed and often temporary, as the Orcs are constantly on the move, driven by the orders of their masters or their own insatiable lust for plunder and destruction. Within Orc society, the strongest and most brutal rise to positions of power, though these positions are often short-lived, as betrayal and murder are common. Orc leaders, often known as captains or chieftains, rule through sheer force and intimidation, and their authority is constantly challenged by those beneath them. This constant infighting and treachery are a reflection of the Orcs' corrupted nature. They are beings incapable of true loyalty or cooperation, driven only by their base desires and the ever-present influence of the dark powers that created them. One of the most significant aspects of Orc society is their relationship with other creatures of darkness, particularly the Uruk-hai, a stronger and more disciplined breed of Orcs created by Sauron and later Saruman. The Uruk-hai, unlike the common Orcs, were bred for greater strength, endurance, and intelligence, making them more formidable opponents in battle. However, their creation further exacerbated the divisions within the ranks of the Orcs, leading to tension and conflict between the different breeds. The Uruk-hai often looked down on the common Orcs, seeing them as weaker and inferior, while the common Orcs resented the Uruk-hai for their perceived superiority. The Orcs' relationship with other dark creatures, such as trolls, wargs, and the Nazgul, is also complex. While these creatures often fought alongside the Orcs in the service of Sauron, the alliances were tenuous at best, held together only by the overriding will of their dark masters. The Orcs feared the Nazgul, the terrifying ringwraiths who served as Sauron's most powerful servants, and they respected the sheer brute strength of the trolls. However, these alliances were not based on mutual respect or cooperation, but rather on mutual necessity and the fear of a greater power. The Orcs' role in the wars of Middle-earth, particularly during the First and Second Ages, is marked by their use as expendable soldiers in the service of Morgoth and later Sauron. They were bred in vast numbers, sent to die in droves on the battlefields, their lives seen as little more than tools to be used and discarded by their masters. Despite their brutality and savagery, the Orcs were not formidable fighters on their own. They relied on overwhelming numbers and the strategic cunning of their leaders to achieve victory. They were not trained soldiers, but rabid, frenzied attackers, driven by a primal urge to kill and destroy. Throughout the First Age, the Orcs served Morgoth in his wars against the Elves, playing a significant role in many of the major battles of that era, such as the Dagor Bragollach, Battle of Sudden Flame, and the Nirnaeth Arnuidiad, Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Despite their numbers, the Orcs often found themselves outmatched by the superior skill and courage of the Elves, particularly the Noldor, who waged a relentless war against Morgoth's forces. However, the sheer number of Orcs, coupled with Morgoth's strategic cunning and the use of other dark creatures like dragons and Balrogs, allowed them to achieve significant victories. The Orcs also played a crucial role in the destruction of the two great elven kingdoms of Beleriand, Gondolin, and Doriath. These victories, however, came at a great cost, as the Orcs suffered enormous casualties, their numbers continually replenished by Morgoth's dark breeding pits. The Orcs' role in these wars was not that of conquerors, but of destroyers, their presence a blight upon the lands they ravaged. After Morgoth's defeat at the end of the First Age, many of his surviving Orcs fled into the deep places of the world, hiding from the wrath of the victorious elves and men. However, the Orcs were far from defeated. They bided their time, multiplying in the shadows, awaiting the rise of a new master. That master came in the form of Sauron, Morgoth's most trusted lieutenant, who took up the mantle of Dark Lord in the Second Age. Under Sauron's rule, the Orcs became the backbone of his armies, playing a central role in his campaigns to dominate Middle-earth. During the Second Age, the Orcs were instrumental in the construction of Sauron's fortress of Barad-dûr and the forging of the One Ring. They also fought in the War of the Elves and Sauron, in which Sauron sought to conquer the Elves and claim dominion over Middle-earth. Despite suffering significant defeats at the hands of the Elves and their allies, the Orcs remained a constant threat, their numbers seemingly endless. The Orcs reached the height of their power during the War of the Last Alliance, a massive conflict that saw the forces of elves and men unite against Sauron. The Orcs fought ferociously in this war, participating in the siege of Barad-dûr, where they defended Sauron's stronghold against the combined might of the Free Peoples. However, their efforts were ultimately in vain, as Sauron was defeated, and the One Ring was taken from him by Isildur, the king of Gondor. Despite their master's defeat, many Orcs survived the war, retreating into the dark places of Middle-earth to lick their wounds and await the return of their Dark Lord. Throughout the Third Age, the Orcs remained a persistent threat, though they were largely confined to the mountains and other remote regions. They raided villages, ambushed travelers, and occasionally waged war on the dwarves, particularly in the Misty Mountains. The Orcs also fought in the service of other dark powers, such as the Witch King of Angmar, who waged a war against the northern kingdom of Arnor. Despite these efforts, the Orcs never regained the power they had under Morgoth or Sauron, their influence waning as the Free Peoples grew stronger. The rise of Sauron once again in the late Third Age marked a resurgence of Orcish power, particularly in the lands of Mordor, where Sauron began amassing a new army of Orcs in preparation for his final war against the Free Peoples. The Orcs of Mordor, alongside the Uruk-hai, bred by Saruman in Isengard, played a crucial role in the events leading up to and during the War of the Ring, participating in some of the most pivotal battles of the age. Despite their numbers and ferocity, the Orcs were ultimately tools of greater powers, their existence tied to the will of their dark masters. Their entire history is one of subjugation, corruption, and conflict, a dark shadow cast upon the world by the evil that created them. Understanding their origins, therefore, is key to understanding their fate, for the destruction of the One Ring and the fall of Sauron marked not just the end of an era, but the beginning of the end for the Orcs, creatures whose very existence was intertwined with the darkness that had plagued Middle-earth for millennia. The role of the Orcs in the War of the Ring is deeply interwoven with the larger narrative of Middle-earth's struggle against Sauron's resurgence. As the Dark Lord sought to reclaim his dominion over the Free Peoples, the Orcs became his most numerous and relentless soldiers, bred for war and driven by a singular purpose: to serve the will of Sauron. Their presence is felt throughout the War of the Ring, from the initial skirmishes to the climactic battles that ultimately decided the fate of Middle-earth. The Orcs were not merely foot soldiers in Sauron's army. They were the backbone of his military might. Sauron, in his preparation for war, had spent years breeding and training vast numbers of Orcs in the dark lands of Mordor. These Orcs were of varying sizes and capabilities, ranging from the smaller, more numerous Snaga to the larger, more fearsome Uruks. While all Orcs were characterized by their brutality and savagery, there were distinct differences in their roles within Sauron's forces. The smaller Orcs, often referred to as Snaga, were used for menial tasks and as fodder in battle. They were the least valued among the Orc ranks, often treated with contempt by their larger brethren. However, their sheer numbers made them a significant force, especially in overwhelming smaller, less fortified targets. Snaga were often tasked with patrolling the borders of Mordor, raiding villages, and maintaining the infrastructure of Sauron's war machine. Despite their lowly status, these Orcs played a crucial role in maintaining the Dark Lord's hold over his territories. The Uruks, on the other hand, were the elite soldiers of Sauron's army. Larger, stronger, and more disciplined than the Snaga, the Uruk were bred for battle. They were fearless and relentless, showing a level of organization and cohesion that was uncommon among other orcs. The Uruks were often used in critical battles where their strength and endurance could turn the tide of combat. Notably, the Uruks were instrumental in the Siege of Gondor, where their strength and ferocity nearly overwhelmed the defenders of Minas Tirith. One of the key characteristics of the Orcs during the War of the Ring was their intense loyalty to Sauron, though this loyalty was not born out of respect or admiration, but rather out of fear and the unyielding dominance of Sauron's will. The Orcs were bound to Sauron through a combination of dark magic, fear of punishment, and a deep-seated hatred for the free peoples of Middle-earth. This hatred was a driving force in their actions, fueling their willingness to fight and die in Sauron's service. However, the Orcs were not a monolithic force. Despite their shared loyalty to Sauron, there were significant divisions and infighting among the different groups of Orcs. This internal strife was particularly evident between the Orcs of Mordor and those of Isengard, who were bred by Saruman. The Isengard Orcs, or Uruk-hai, were bred to be stronger and more resilient, able to withstand sunlight, which traditionally weakened other Orcs. This made them a formidable force, capable of fighting at any time and under any conditions, unlike their Mordor counterparts who preferred the cover of darkness. The rivalry between these groups often led to conflict, as seen in the aftermath of the capture of Merry and Pippin. The Orcs of Mordor, led by Grishnak, and the Uruk-hai of Isengard, led by Ugluk, clashed over the fate of the hobbits, each group seeking to claim the prize for their respective masters. This internal discord ultimately led to the downfall of the Orcs in that particular mission, as their inability to cooperate allowed the hobbits to escape and led to the decimation of the Orc party by the Riders of Rohan. This incident is emblematic of a larger pattern within Orc society: their inability to form lasting, stable alliances or work together for a common cause. While they were united under the banner of Sauron, the underlying tensions and mistrust among them were ever present. This disunity was one of the key weaknesses of the Orcs, preventing them from fully capitalizing on their numerical superiority. The role of the Orcs in major battles, such as the Battle of Helm's Deep and the Siege of Gondor, cannot be understated. In both instances, the Orcs were at the forefront of the assault, throwing themselves against the walls and fortifications of their enemies with reckless abandon. At Helm's Deep, the Uruk-hai, led by Saruman's lieutenants, assaulted the fortress with a terrifying ferocity, using crude explosives and siege weapons to breach the walls. The defenders, led by Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and King Theoden, were hard-pressed to hold back the tide of Orcs pouring into the fortress. The battle was a testament to the sheer tenacity and brute force of the Orcs, who fought without fear of death, driven by their orders and their innate bloodlust. Similarly, during the Siege of Gondor, the Orcs of Mordor launched a massive assault on the city of Minas Tirith. The battle was one of the largest and most pivotal of the War of the Ring, with thousands of Orcs storming the city's defenses. They were supported by siege towers, catapults, and the terrifying battering ram Grond, which was used to break through the gates of the city. The Orcs showed no mercy, slaughtering any who stood in their way, their eyes fixed on the prize of capturing Gondor's capital. Despite their ferocity and numbers, the Orcs ultimately failed to capture Minas Tirith, largely due to the timely arrival of the Riders of Rohan and the intervention of Aragorn, who led the forces of the dead to break the siege. The defeat at Minas Tirith was a significant blow to Sauron's plans, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Orcs in the War of the Ring. As the war drew to a close, the Orcs were involved in one final desperate confrontation: the Battle of the Morannon, also known as the Battle of the Black Gate. This battle was a last-ditch effort by Sauron to crush the remaining forces of the Free Peoples and secure his dominion over Middle-earth. The Orcs, along with other dark creatures such as trolls and Easterlings, formed the bulk of Sauron's army in this battle. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that their very existence was tied to the outcome of the battle. However, the tide turned against them when the One Ring was destroyed, leading to the collapse of Sauron's power and the disintegration of his forces. The fall of Sauron marked the end of an era in Middle-earth, and with it came the collapse of Orcish power. The destruction of the One Ring not only ended Sauron's dominion, but also shattered the cohesion of his armies. The Orcs, who had been bound to Sauron's will through fear and dark magic, were suddenly left leaderless and directionless. Without the guiding hand of their Dark Master, the Orcs descended into chaos. In the immediate aftermath of Sauron's defeat, the Orcs were thrown into disarray. Many of them, particularly those in Mordor, were killed in the ensuing chaos as the land itself reacted violently to Sauron's fall. The fires of Mount Doom erupted, and the dark towers and fortresses of Mordor crumbled. The Orcs who survived this initial destruction found themselves without purpose, their very reason for existence taken from them. Some attempted to flee, seeking refuge in the deep, dark places of the world, where they might escape the retribution of the Free Peoples. Others turned on each other, as the fragile alliances that had held them together under Sauron's rule dissolved into infighting and bloodshed. The collapse of Sauron's power also had a profound impact on the Orcs' sense of identity. For millennia, the Orcs had been defined by their servitude to the Dark Lords, first Morgoth and then Sauron. Their entire culture, if it could be called that, was built around warfare, destruction, and subjugation. With Sauron's fall, the very foundation of their society was ripped away, leaving them adrift in a world that had no place for them. The Orcs, who had always been creatures of darkness, now found themselves in a world where the forces of light had triumphed, and there was no longer any dark power to serve. The surviving Orcs scattered across Middle-earth, but their numbers were greatly diminished, and they were hunted mercilessly by the Free Peoples. The Dunedain, the Elves, and the Dwarves all took part in these hunts, determined to rid the world of the last remnants of Sauron's forces. In the north, the Rangers of the North and the Elves of Rivendell pursued the Orcs who had fled from the Misty Mountains, while in the south, the forces of Gondor and Rohan scoured the lands of Mordor and its surrounding regions. The Orcs, who had once been the terror of Middle-earth, were now little more than prey, hunted down and driven into extinction. Some Orcs, however, managed to escape the wrath of the Free Peoples, retreating into the remote and inhospitable regions of Middle-earth. These Orcs eked out a miserable existence in the mountains, forests, and caves, far from the reach of their enemies. They lived in constant fear, always on the lookout for the soldiers of Gondor, or the Elves of Lorien, who might come to finish what they had started. These remnants of Sauron's once great armies became little more than shadows, lingering on the fringes of a world that no longer had a place for them. In the years following the War of the Ring, the Orcs continued to dwindle in number. Without the support of a Dark Lord to organize and sustain them, they were unable to replenish their ranks or rebuild their society. Their already limited resources became even scarcer, and their constant infighting further weakened them. Some Orcs, particularly those in the north, attempted to raid settlements or waylay travelers, but these efforts were met with swift and deadly reprisals. The Free Peoples of Middle-earth, now united and vigilant, were determined to ensure that the Orcs would never again rise to threaten their peace. The Orcs who managed to survive into the Fourth Age found themselves in a world that was increasingly hostile to their existence. The power of men was ascendant, with the kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan expanding their influence across Middle-earth. The Elves, though slowly departing to the west, remained vigilant, particularly in regions like Mirkwood and Lothlorien, where the threat of dark creatures still lingered. The Dwarves, too, played a role in the final suppression of the Orcs, particularly in the Misty Mountains and the Lonely Mountain, where they reclaimed their ancient homelands and drove out the remnants of Orcish bands. The fate of the Orcs in the Fourth Age is one of gradual decline and extinction. With their numbers reduced and their ability to breed new generations severely compromised, the Orcs became little more than a memory, a dark shadow in the history of Middle-earth. Their story, which had begun in the dark pits of Angband and the breeding grounds of Mordor, ended in the remote corners of the world, where the last of their kind faded into obscurity. The destruction of the One Ring and the fall of Sauron marked a turning point not only for the free peoples of Middle-earth, but also for the Orcs, who found themselves without a purpose or a master. The world that emerged from the ashes of the War of the Ring was one in which the Orcs had no place, and their decline was as inevitable as it was tragic. In the end, the Orcs were victims of the very darkness they had served, creatures whose existence was tied to the fate of the Dark Lords they had followed for millennia. As the light of a new age dawned in Middle-earth, the Orcs, creatures of shadow and darkness, were left behind, their story coming to a quiet and forgotten end. Tolkien's depiction of the Orcs is not only a narrative device, but also a reflection of deeper themes that permeate his work. The Orcs, as embodiments of corruption and evil, are central to Tolkien's exploration of the nature of evil and its impact on the world. They represent a perversion of the natural order, creatures who were twisted and deformed by dark powers to serve a malevolent purpose. This perversion is not just physical, but also spiritual and moral, as the Orcs are portrayed as beings who have lost any semblance of free will or moral agency, bound to the will of their dark masters. Tolkien's portrayal of the Orcs raises important questions about the nature of evil and the possibility of redemption. The Orcs are depicted as inherently evil, creatures who are incapable of goodness or moral choice. This raises the question of whether the Orcs are truly responsible for their actions, or whether they are simply victims of the dark forces that created them. Tolkien himself grappled with this question, particularly in his later writings, where he considered the possibility that the Orcs, as corrupted beings, might have once had the potential for good, but were irredeemably twisted by Morgoth and Sauron. The moral implications of the Orcs' existence are further complicated by the fact that they are not simply mindless monsters, but sentient beings with their own thoughts, desires, and fears. While they are driven by hatred and malice, they are also capable of fear, anger, and even a rudimentary form of loyalty, albeit one that is rooted in fear rather than genuine respect. This complexity adds a layer of tragedy to their story, as the Orcs are not just mindless pawns of evil, but beings who have been utterly corrupted and dehumanized by the forces of darkness. Tolkien's exploration of the Orcs and their fate can be seen as a reflection of his broader themes of free will, redemption, and the corrupting influence of power. The Orcs, as creatures who have lost their free will and moral agency, represent the ultimate consequence of the corruption of power. They are beings who have been so thoroughly dominated by evil that they are incapable of escaping its influence, even in the face of their own destruction. This loss of agency is a key aspect of Tolkien's depiction of evil, which he portrays as a force that seeks to dominate and control, stripping individuals of their autonomy and reducing them to mere tools of its will. The Orcs' role in the War of the Ring and their eventual fate also highlight the theme of the cyclical nature of evil in Tolkien's work. The Orcs, like the Dark Lords they served, are part of a cycle of corruption and destruction that has plagued Middle-earth for millennia. Their story is one of rise and fall, as they are created, used, and ultimately discarded by the forces of darkness. This cycle is ultimately broken by the destruction of the One Ring, which marks the end of the Age of Darkness and the beginning of a new era of peace. However, the fate of the Orcs serves as a reminder that the scars of evil do not simply disappear. and that the consequences of darkness can linger long after its defeat. In the end, the fate of the Orcs is a tragic one, as they are beings who were created for a singular purpose and who found themselves lost and purposeless in a world that had moved beyond the darkness they served. Their story is one of corruption, domination, and ultimately extinction, as they fade into the forgotten corners of Middle-earth, leaving behind only a dark memory of the evil they once embodied.